Welcome to How Hard Can It Be, the podcast where we explore AI one question at a time.
Hey, welcome back to How Hard Can It Be? Today's guest is Jonathan Baier, a seasoned technology executive, DevOps author, and AI infrastructure strategist. He's helped lead cloud and DevOps transformation at major enterprises like Moody's, authored foundational books on Kubernetes and AI platforms, and today advises companies as a fractional CTO/CISO through his firm Cyberify. His focus, helping businesses adopt AI safely, scalably, and securely. Jonathan brings a unique perspective, one that spans from cloud-native foundations to organizational design. And today we're diving deep into the real challenges of scaling AI responsibly. With that said, hey, welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for being and joining the show.
Hey, thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Let's dive right into it. So let's start with AI adoption in the enterprise. How much of this wave of AI adoption is a pure technical challenge or only a technical challenge, code infrastructure, etc.? And how much does it come down to organizational mindset? In other words, is it just a tech problem, or is there significant, rethinking transformation necessary at the enterprise level?
Yeah, so I don't think it'll be surprising to say that it's both. As with a lot of new technologies, there's changes in both areas. I will say there's some unique technical challenges with AI that that can make it a little bit more on the technical side than previous transformations, but really there's still a large amount on the organizational and culture side of things. And kind of
Okay.
having a clear message from your leadership, as always with any transformation, is still key. But because of those sort of technical aspects, it's important for those leaders to sort of understand a bit more about what they're leading and how they need to change.
Right. So can legacy org structures actually survive in the age of AI? How should leaders think about, silos, teams, matrix organizations, and the entire construct? Can that stay intact and you can still be successful with AI, or is it bound to fail if the organization doesn't adopt?
Yeah, I mean, we saw this with previous transformations. Moves to the cloud, moves to sort of DevOps or adopting microservices. There's definitely changes that need to happen, and that the most successful organizations are going to undertake. I think I'm a big believer in Conway's law, right? Your organizational structure is going to sort of influence and even define your actual technical architecture. So yeah, I think the legacy organizations can certainly survive, but probably not in the way they are today, right? There's change that needs to happen. You have to be brave and sort of embrace that and move forward, even if it's slowly. But be brave, move forward, and embrace that technology. And I think many of the legacy organizations will be happy with this one, in that even though there is maybe a little bit of a technical jump in the beginning, and there's always challenges with changing, that the gains can be quite significant if it's used the right way.
Now, you led the large-scale transformations of cloud infrastructure and DevOps, for example. Any lessons that you think would equally apply to the AI transformation field?
Yeah, I actually kind of look at it as almost like a history book and sort of different foundational layers, right? So when we started getting into cloud and helping enterprises, back many years ago, I was a consultant for a company called Cloud Technology Partners. We helped a lot of enterprises, financial services, healthcare, you name it, all over the industries. We helped them make that transition to cloud. And as we started to do that, we really started to build elements of what later became zero trust architecture. On the development side, we started to embrace, things like containers, and then containerization started to become popular, and microservices, and all of that worked really well with this idea of DevOps. And so I take all of those sort of, buzzwords or movements from, a decade ago, and you fast forward those things really create some nice underpinnings where you've got, sort of flexible identity, being able to sort of verify um, the identity and have more granularity there, being able to be agile with your DevOps sort of practices. That really is going to help you embrace these technologies faster and more safely and responsibly.
That makes good sense. Thinking back at the early days of the internet, it took us quite a long time to drive is an effective cybersecurity posture, right? So for a long time, cybersecurity was on the back foot, and it seems like permanently catching up. We might argue this is still the case today, but in the earlier days, this was very apparent, and the famous Equifax breach, and so on and so forth. So it went through a quite long maturity cycle. How does this look like with AI? Are CISOs better prepared? Do you think they're more ready, or will we see, a comparable lag between rapid adoption and then the cybersecurity posture or practice kind of, trying to catch up on a constant basis?
Yeah, I think there's good news and bad news there. I think the bad news is, and I don't think this will be a surprise for any CISO that's out there, but um, most organizations, security organizations, are buried by just the amount of threats and um, responsibilities they have day to day. It's become more and more difficult to keep up. Um, Now generative AI has come on the scenes and sort of just hit the gas pedal on that. So there is a lot happening very quickly, and I think the risk is to sort of just be still getting used to sort of drowning in the deluge of everything and assuming like, hey, I can keep swimming faster and keeping up. I do think it's one of those areas where it's hard to say, hey, slow down to speed up, but I think that actually really applies well here is, really understand the unique challenges of AI. We always tell our clients to look at it from three lenses: security of AI, meaning you've got AI enabled applications that you're building within the company, from AI, which is unfortunately the part where we're accelerating the threats, right? The threat actors are now more powerful because they're using AI enabled tools. But then finally, the good news with AI, how can you actually evaluate and use some of these new tools to fight back and actually get some scale and help you get above water once again? So I think it is a sort of precarious time for CISOs, but I do think there is some light at the end of the tunnel and a path to a better future.
Well, that sounds optimistic. That's great. What about cloud, right? So, similar to the internet challenge in cybersecurity, once cloud transformation became mainstream, we almost had a kind of a rewind, from unsecured S3 buckets and, low-level threats that, were not obvious at the time and became standard practice. Do you think that enterprises who have operated in the cloud, let's say for 5 to 10 years, are ready for AI in the cloud? Or do you think that the cloud itself, the infrastructure, the way we have deployed it in itself inherently, presents risks to the usage of AI?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was similar in the beginning of adopting cloud, where there was this feeling of like, hey, it's not my infrastructure anymore; it's someone else's, and so they're doing all the security, they've got certifications, everything's great. But of course, we know that was not the case. We have saw some pretty impactful breaches in the early days. In fact, entire cloud accounts getting deleted, so the infrastructure and businesses went up in smoke. So, I think it's always important to kind of take a sober approach to these things and not just say, hey, they're going to take care of everything. Um, that said, I think there's very mature capabilities within the cloud providers, but it's always been about understanding what you're building, understanding the tools that are there, and being able to utilize those the right way. And then at the end of the day, taking the responsibility for your side of the sort of shared responsibility model, right? I always found it funny how folks would reference the shared responsibility model. Not everyone, but sometimes you'd find folks sort of assuming that meant the cloud provider was going to do everything, and it's
Right.
shared. So
Like I
you
was,
really have to make sure you're paying attention to your side of it and focus more attention on that.
yeah, can you outsource trust, right? And to which degree can and should you do that?
Yeah.
Um, a lot of conversations we have with clients and early adopters is really the question where to start, right? Because if you look at AI or generative AI, and I guess we're going to venture to agentic AI a bit later, the conversations we have is where do I even start? Who should own what, right? You have regulatory, you have privacy, you have the safety and security aspects. So it often, ends in the responsibility or with the responsibility of the CISO. But I feel there is a much broader cross-functional alignment and orchestration required in AI safety and security than we have seen with legacy security problems and solutions. So can we touch on that? Like, where do companies ideally start, right? When the CEO proclaims we need an AI strategy, and how should we think about ownership and responsibility distribution when it comes to AI in an enterprise?
Yeah, 100%. I think something that was a practice when we adopted cloud and some of these previous new technologies was to start to sort of reach across the table, build partnerships across the organization. But it's just become even more important here because things are moving faster. There's new technical pieces of it to understand, and there's just the scale of it and the pace of change these days in technology. You really can't expect one person to do it all, no matter how smart they are, right? So having those relationships and having really an organization that can work together is really key, and that's one of the things we really focus on is sort of some of these human challenges in adopting new technologies. But I think it's really key to be reaching out to your business partners, understanding how they're using AI, right? There's almost certainly already usage of it in your organization. So try to understand the technology at the same time you're understanding how are our business teams getting their initial value from it. That is so important. And I think, that lets you build a bridge and take security from sort of the teams that come in and say, no, you can't do this, or, oh, please slow down, to someone who's coming along with you for the journey. And I think that makes all the difference.
Yeah, that makes great sense. Thank you. Let's move to the AI skill gap, or whether there is a skill gap, right? Again, in the cybersecurity days, we saw the numbers every year, how many, millions of cybersecurity professionals we are short. And prior to generative AI, most people would have associated AI with the role or profession or skill set of a data scientist. But the more we work with enterprises and we look into what's happening, is the data scientist still the primary role for AI, or is the data scientist now a role that goes into very specific niches, use cases, custom development? But if you stand up a standard solution with RAG and Gen AI models and so on and so forth, do you really need a data scientist, or do you need an AI solution developer, which in my mind does not necessarily have to be a data scientist?
It's really important to, again, as I said in the last topic we were talking about, that the organizational partnership is really key. There's still data scientists, of course, but and they have their roles to play. But there is quite a bit that's being built on top of these models now, and even just looking at how do you serve these models, how do you kind of create that infrastructure. But even if you're not serving your own model, you're using kind of a largely kind of SaaS provider or API out there, then you have to think about the unique security challenges, the unique challenges you have around being responsible, and not all of those really fit well into a data scientist model, or even someone who's deep on how AI models work. It's more about thinking about how maybe the attackers are going to approach them, or understanding how to scale something and be able to handle large amounts of traffic. So there's all these aspects. I think all the things that have traditionally been done in running an application and running infrastructure for a large organization, they're still there. They're just a little bit different now with these AI enabled tools. And so, yeah, I don't think it's just data scientists. I think uh, there is a gap in that, there are these specifics to AI, things like, prompt injection, which, many security professionals are going to hear that and they say, well, that sounds like SQL injection from back in the day. And they're not wrong, But there's a specific angle of what's the difference between, say, a prompt injection versus poisoning the model versus poisoning some data that you're pulling in from some third-party feed. So there's just those nuances, and I think that's the piece where it's really important for uh, the security organizations, as I said earlier, like to slow down. One of the things I mean by that is create space for that learning to happen, create space for your organization as a whole to kind of learn these nuances.
Got it. So I would expect we can see some kind of specialization and segmentation, in the AI profession where, and again, I'm drawing the parallels with security, where you had a security engineer in the early days, and then it started to become highly specialized, right, from the SOC analyst to and so on and so forth. So can we expect something in AI similar to your point? Somebody who is more on the data science side, somebody who might be more on the prompt engineering side, somebody who's more on the data handling and processing side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the specialization is still there. In some cases, it may move up to a higher level, which I think is actually kind of the fun level, I would call it. I think many people have kind of compared it to you're now you're now a manager, even if you were previously like sort of a hands-on person, or you're now the CEO of a small company. And what that really means is that it's, for example, if you've worked with what they're calling vibe coding or using AI to assist you in coding, you're doing less of the actual typing out the actual lines of code and more of thinking about these larger architectural design ideas, right? Okay, I've got an application. I want to add a caching layer to that, but I want to be able to toggle it on and off, or I want it to be able to check when it last refreshed data. Um, you know, that becomes catching. Obviously, that's a deep area of its own, but thinking about it from that higher level becomes your job rather than having to deal with the nuances of whatever programming language you're working in. And so I think on the security side, you've got um, more ability to think about um, the attack vectors and the attackers themselves and how they might move and change their behavior, um, and then use the tools to sort of just feed you that information rather than say spend 2 weeks writing a new rule for your sim to try to catch the bad guys. Yeah.
We did an article the other day about natural language being the new coding language. Um, so we told our kids the last years, go into coding, go in engineering and coding, and now we're basically telling them, no, don't do coding anymore. It's kind of obsolete because natural language is the way to go. To your point, can we try to look in the future? How does a coder or developer role, how might that look like in 6 months, 12 months, when we don't operate on a specific coding language anymore, where we basically encode, step by step, where we have to handle every single exceptions, to a point where anybody ultimately in any department, right, can create agents, for example, and that's a good segue to agents by using natural language and by basically focus on the outcomes they want to produce rather than how to get to that outcome, right? Because how to get that outcome now becomes the job of AI, the job of the agentic workflow, for example.
Yeah, I think the when folks say, "Hey, we've been teaching our kids how to do coding, and they're not going to code anymore," it's sort of a very vague topic when we say we taught them to code. It really depends on what that was. I don't think it was a mistake in the sense that you're teaching kids how to think through a problem, break down that problem. Those were, in my mind, the important parts. If anything, I think maybe the mistake was to not tell them also focus on English class or whatever the language is your native language. But those sort of communication skills have now become more important, and that means that folks that weren't technical but were good communicators have some opportunities. But I also think if you started as a kid learning programming, you might have seen like how do you make a peanut butter jelly sandwich? That was like that's something I see often for kids learning, and that's teaching you how do I break down the problem? How do I understand that? And that's something that's still really important because the model's going to take something in a direction, but it's not going to be able to say, hey, the direction is wrong unless you've told it that, or it's been sort of fine tuned with some um, sort of direction in mind. And so I think it's really important to still have that engineering mindset.
Right,
So
analytical thinking, being able to structure a problem. So not necessarily knowing the actual language or the intricacies of the coding itself, but the ability to have a high level understanding of how it works, how to analyze it, how to segment the problem, and how basically to guide AI towards the outcome that you're seeking. Got it.
yeah,
Okay.
100%. Yeah.
Let's talk about guardrails and let's try to kind of pivot to agentic AI. So a lot of enterprises we talk to, they're just at the stage where they're thinking of safety and security and guardrails for, their customer chatbot, let's say, right? While this is new and, presents novel risks and challenges, it is probably the simplest use case that we see, right? Because it's a human to a machine and a machine to a human, so prompt and response. And all of a sudden, there's this rush to agentic AI and AI agents and, basically, ringing in the, next revolution and so on and so forth. Obviously, there's a big difference between aspiration and what works reliably in practice today. But we see this drive and this need to announce that everybody now has agents and everybody's using agents. Whether it's true or not, or how effective they are not, is a different question. But how do you expect CISOs or security professionals to cope with that, right? So we're still talking about how do I secure, safeguard, control human to machine interaction, which is basically, as we said, prompt and response. And now you're potentially looking at agentic AI, where between the user input and the final output to the user, there might be 10, 15, 20 agents orchestrated and use different data sources, third parties, with all these novel challenges. I mean, is it the same approach you suggest here? Baby steps and kind of feel yourself into this space, because from a security perspective, it's kind of a magnitude of attack vectors and risks we see compared to a standard chatbot, let's say.
Yeah, I agree. I think to some extent, I think the move to agentic AI is a little bit of uh, kind of waving hands and distracting folks to some of the real challenges that are there. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of opportunity and value from agentic AI, but to your point, you move from a very transparent process of being able to see a user type in a prompt and get the response back, um, to what can go through multiple layers. And I think just because of how it's been presented, it creates this idea that, oh, we don't have to worry about that. We're just going to give it to the agent. The agent's going to figure it out. But the agent at the end of the day is just actually adding a couple of layers in there. It might be calling some APIs to get certain data or make certain actions happen. That's a good thing. Those APIs are more sort of traditional deterministic systems potentially. So that could help give you some more consistency with what you're trying to achieve. But in order to make those calls, it's using the LLM to sort of decide what it needs to do. It can still make mistakes there. It can still misunderstand the API spec, and uh, because they're so open-ended, and this idea of agentic AI is this autonomous entity that's out there taking action, I think folks often miss things like granular permissions, right? Like we just want this agent to go out and do a bunch of stuff. Well, actually, you don't, because if you think about where those failure modes might happen, um, if it has too much permission, that could potentially be very disastrous. And then also, the transparency is not there, where there is still prompts happening, but they're in layers. And as you mentioned, there could be multiple agentic layers, and so they're layering on, adding system prompts, um, potentially pulling things in to put in those prompts, and so you have uh, a lot of areas where attackers could potentially take advantage of something, and you don't necessarily understand how the interaction with the LLM is happening. Um, so yeah, I think it's key to make sure you have a good understanding within the organization of what you're doing, and also, how much you're exposing, how much you're putting at risk, whether from a permissions point of view or from just the data point of view, and sort of like the use cases.
So, in your opinion, CEOs that are announcing 20, 30% cuts in employment over the next 2, 3 years, we're not there yet, right? So sometimes, I discuss with people the difference between will you lose your job to AI or you're going to lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI. And I ask myself, is the hey, I lose my job to somebody who knows how to use AI simply a transition period, and we're actually going to see people lose jobs directly comparable to an AI agent? How far you're away do you think time-wise from the point where we can reliably, with good control of risk, start replacing human-driven processes entirely with AI to a degree that we can actually, back to these announcements, cut workforce and save cost on human labor? I know
Yeah, I mean,
it's a glass ball question, but I'd love your take on that.
no, I mean that's it's what's on everybody's minds, right? Especially with some of the announcements out of Amazon this week. I've seen a lot of stuff in my feed about this. I think um, over time, yeah, there is work that could get taken over by agentic AI. I think the bigger risk short term in my mind is, will companies try to find cost saving measures, even if it's at the expense of a lower quality output? And unfortunately, I think often the answer is yes. So does that mean, uh, you know, that there could be cuts and, or at least, hiring freezes and folks trying to use agentic AI to replace that? I think, yeah, unfortunately, that may happen. Uh, my feeling is that you still get more value out of having that combination. And so um, you're probably going to see the pendulum swing, right? You're going to see companies seeing how much they can wring out of out of the rag, how much they can do this for less dollars, and then I think you'll see competition where folks that are using AI to be more impactful rather than to fire people or downsize are going to be the companies that are going to actually start succeeding and getting more of the market share. Um,
So not a one-to-one replacement, but a lower replacement rate for the benefit of making the, let's call it, remaining staff more productive by utilizing AI. But, not a one-to-one replacement in that sense.
yeah, 100%. I mean, with the cloud, we saw a similar fear. It wasn't quite as large because of just it's much more fundamental shift in paradigm. But in the early days, a lot of the companies we helped would have that same question of like, hey, am I going to lose my job? And honestly, what we ended up seeing was the companies that went all in on cloud, went native, and really had big successes were the ones that said, hey, let's take our entire workforce, let's take several hundred, maybe thousands of people, let's get them upskilled on cloud, right? They stuck them in workshops. They cleared out a week or two of time and brought folks together and helped them learn how to use the new technology. And then by slowing down and doing that within the years that followed, they were able to really just increase their productivity and outshine their competition, frankly.
Perfect. Final question, Jonathan, and this might be a tricky one, but let's say I'm a an executive. I want to deploy agentic. I want to benefit from agentic AI. What are the three main things I should start with or thinking about? That kind of gives me a higher probability of success and kind of a good North Star as I drive that agenda through my enterprise.
Yeah, so I think I've kind of talked about it ad nauseum about the slowing down and making sure you understand getting that upskilling. I think that is a key piece. Another key piece that was true with previous transitions and is even more true now, which is data gravity. Data is so important, and having really your hands around the data strategy and the security of that data, the granularity of kind of the access models to that is really important, and something that unfortunately I think many organizations still have a lot of work to do there. So I would be looking at that early. That's something where you may not need as much upskilling as learning all these new AI technologies, but for whatever reason, just haven't been able to prioritize that in the past. So that's something that really should be coming to the forefront of your mind. And then the second one being identity, uh, maturing your sort of identity and access management strategy, looking at things like zero trust architecture. Maybe you've started that, but you've ran into challenges, but that's going to give you some agility here, and being able to sort of have a really good data security strategy, and be flexible on that identity so that you can really have more capabilities around not just humans interacting with your systems, but as we just talked about, agentic systems, uh, making changes, making calls all over your network. You need to be able to facilitate that. So those are kind of like two areas that I feel like you probably have the knowledge in your team now, but you just need to prioritize those as you're saying, okay, let's learn these new skills.
Perfect. Great. Hey, Jonathan, really, really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insights. Thank you very much. And I hope we can have you back in one of the future episodes.
Yeah, I would love that. It was a great time. Thank you so much.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Aiceberg. In just 5 minutes, Aiceberg becomes a guardian agent that oversees all AI traffic, enforces policies, and protects your enterprise from AI breach. Learn more at aiceberg.ai.